We're going to open our Bibles tonight to Luke chapter 17, verse 11. And as you're looking for that, if you can find 2 Kings chapter 5 as well. We are going to go back there just for a part of an example, and we'll be running into that on Wednesday. My intention is, excuse me, my intention is next Wednesday night to go back to our historical book studies. We wanted to wait till we came back. We have a lot of handouts for you to have, notes that I think you'll need as we go through the Kings and the Chronicles, just to keep the kings straight and who died and who rose and reigned, I should say, not who rose. And we'd like to have you have all that information. So we've been doing this study on character studies that can change our characters as we've been apart, and we'll do that and finish that up tonight. But our hope is to go back to our Through the Bible next Wednesday night, especially in those historical books. It is our intention, if the Lord allows, when we finish the historical books, to do the book of Revelation on Wednesday night. The Lord is coming soon. We might as well get ready, don't you think? So it's been a while since we've done that, and I would look forward to doing that with you. About 20 years ago, there was a lady named Marianne Franco. She was from Okeechobee, Florida. She had been blind for 20 years or so in a car accident. She had severed her optic nerve. And so 20 years later, she had a falling down in her home, and it required surgery on her spine to alleviate the pain in her neck because of her fall and in her arm. When she woke up, she could see. In fact, out of her mouth, the words were, "Lady, you with all of that purple on, can you do something for me?" And the local ABC affiliate in Florida made a big deal out of it, as they should have. But from that day after that procedure, she could see. The doctor that did the procedure, a neurosurgeon named John Alfshar, he said, "There's no way what I did would have affected her sight. This is a miracle of God." Well, tonight we're going to look at a miracle of God. And I wanted you to think about that in terms of what we learn here as we look at the lessons from a nameless 10th leper. There were 10 lepers in the story, but there's only one that we want to focus on. And there's a couple of things I think that we can learn from these character studies. I've always liked doing them. I think the Bible brings Jesus right to your doorstep when you get to sit down with him and one other person and just watch his interaction, the words that he speaks, and how he carries them along. And here is certainly a man that we don't know much about. In fact, he pops up here, and this is the only place we find him. But he goes to obey the Lord in his desire to be delivered from his despair. And he finds God's grace, and he finds a real, complete life as he comes to know the Lord for who he is. And something more important than even his healing takes place. Unfortunately, many of us not only lack our faith in terms of doing what the Lord tells us, but then when he responds, we oftentimes aren't very grateful. We're a pretty spoiled people. I think if you've done any traveling, there are more places in the world that are suffering for just not having than you'll ever find in our midst. God has greatly blessed us. And so instead of living satisfied kind of lives, we're constantly wanting more and grumbling about what we don't have and making that ever longer I need list. It was Alexander White, who was the preeminent, probably, Scottish preacher of the 19th century, who told a story about visiting an elder woman in the hospital who was on her deathbed. And he said, "I went to see her. I wanted to minister to her." And he said, "I never could get a word in sideways. All she would do was complain." And he said, "I tried for a half an hour to just kind of slow her down and all. And no, she just was not taking it. She was just going to complain and complain and complain." He said, "I finally left with Psalm 103, verse 2, and I said, 'Bless the Lord, O my soul. Don't forget all of his benefits.' And he walked out." He said this lady died complaining. Well, faith and thanksgiving kind of go together, don't they? It's hard to separate the two. If you lose one, you invariably will lose the other. And that certainly is true in our story here as well. Historically, there's never been a culture like ours in the West that has been given so much and yet finds itself so ungrateful. It's an ugly road where you want more and are thankful less. So If you read through the Bible and you read about faith and you read about thanksgiving, they are both descriptions of the character of a believer, someone that trusts the Lord, right? Be anxious for nothing. In prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known unto God with thanksgiving. It's that faith that works with thanksgiving. It characterizes the believer. It also characterizes the one who is not a believer. When Paul wrote to Timothy in his last letter to him, he said, men in the last days will become really lovers of themselves, makes a whole long list, and towards the end he puts, and they'll be unthankful and they'll be unholy. It's just a character trait of someone who doesn't know God. They're not very graceful for what they've been given. Paul said when they knew God, they wouldn't glorify him as God. They were not thankful, and so God gave them over to their ways, to their thoughts, to their foolish hearts that were darkened. So, let's look at verse 11 as we look at this, small story here in Luke. It says, now it happened as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee, and he entered into a certain village. There met him 10 men who were lepers who stood afar off. From Jerusalem, or if you're going from the north down to the south to Jerusalem to Judah, there is a border between the Galilee and the north, and really Samaria is in the center of the country. We don't know what town he arrived in, Jesus, and we don't know this man's name at all, or for that matter, any of these 10 lepers. But we know that he met some voices that were crying to him afar off. In fact, we'll read in verse 13 that they cried from afar off. Verse 12, they stood far away, and then they began to cry. And verse 14 says, when he saw them. So it seems like Jesus was greeted with a chorus of people crying out in a desperate situation his name. And before he saw them, he heard them. And when he saw them, he responded to them. 10 lepers, ostracized from society due to their afflictions, crying out for Jesus' mercy. We've been going through this pandemic for quite some time. I'm impressed with a lot of things. I've been asking the Lord, what do I need to learn through all of this? It is amazing how quickly the world can topple, though, don't you think? In a moment's time, everyone in the world can't travel, can't breathe through their regular everybody's got masks. The thing's just nuts, right? Crazy. In a moment's time. Imagine when the Lord just says, that's it. It'll be it. Well, put yourself in the leper's shoes for a minute. He can't be around his family, can't hug his children, no kiss on the cheek, no closeness with anyone, no friends. The isolation, it was the worst. It was suffering that was brought because of his illness. It is suffering that makes you sit in every other row and apart from each other if you're not family. It's crazy. We hope it is important. We will get through it, I'm sure. But that's kind of our current dilemma. It was certainly the dilemma of someone who had leprosy. Leprosy in the Bible is one of the most horrific kind of diseases that is found. It's found both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. It is always used by the Lord to communicate to us what sin is all about, what it can do to us, how it works, how it destroys, what its end is all about. Back in the law, in Leviticus chapter 13 and 14, the Lord gave the responsibility, if you will, or assigned the priests the responsibility of being the ones who would diagnose possible cases of leprosy. And you can read there about skin scabs and colors that are changing and blotches that are suddenly appearing. And if they were unsure, that they were to quarantine, it's another word we've learned pretty well, and then re-examine them a week or two later. But because of the way the leprosy is transmitted, it's very, what's the word I want to use? It's very inconsistent, if you will, in its transmission. And so you might infect others, you might not. It was a frightening thought. But the purpose was to isolate the person who had been infected so that they don't infect anyone else. He's to be unclean, we read in Leviticus 13. He is to dwell by himself. He is to be put outside the city walls or outside the camp. He literally was given a death sentence while he was alive. You just go out and stay away from everyone and yell when people get near you that you're an infected human being. Can you imagine? Not having iPhones, they probably weren't able to track them yet. But it is an interesting disease because for the longest time, its origins were very mysterious. Certainly in the Bible, it was an incurable disease. You couldn't really touch it. If you got it, you were going to be killed by it, and it was going to be a horrible way to die. Today, leprosy is called Hansen's disease. It was named after the bacillus, the guy that discovered the bacillus. It can be controlled with medication. It cannot be cured to this day. So in that sense, I think the type holds up. It's incurable by human standards. It's very insidious in the fact that it causes a great deal of damage before it presents itself. It is deadly accurate. It attacks nerve endings and organs. And like I said, hands, rot, fingers fall off, toes have no circulation, vital organs fail. It's just a horrible, horrible disease. Kind of like sin, isn't it? Sin is never often or I shouldn't say never, is almost never acknowledged by people or addressed until the effects of it take hold and they see what it has done to them. It blinds us spiritually, and if you leave it alone, unchecked or untreated by the Lord, it will lead to a horrible eternal death. So in Jesus' day, in Old Testament Israel, lepers lived in colonies or they lived alone. Their only way of survival was not to get a job. No one could employ them, so they had to beg, have people leave things for them as they walked away from it, or to feed themselves on the trash or the things that were being thrown out over the city walls by the people. You could not touch one for fear of getting contaminated. It would obviously leave you ceremonially unclean, but I think probably people were much more worried about getting sick. And this leper was obligated, according to Numbers 5 and here as well, you see it, to just yell out, unclean, I am unclean. Imagine you introducing yourself to everyone that you see. Unclean, I'm infected, stay away from me. What kind of life would you live? What a horrible way to have to live your life. Well, the appearance of those with leprosy would have been frightening. It would be the walking dead, oozing sores and lack of nerve sensitivity, and because of that, they would often hurt themselves. Maybe their hand would fall into the fire, or they would touch something that they didn't feel, and they would kind of just rot away. It's very graphic. So in this little town, unnamed, in the middle of the country, as Jesus is headed for Jerusalem and the temple, a colony of 10 lepers yell for him from a distance. Their disease had been destroying them day by day. There was no hope in sight. It was uncurable. They were isolated. They were suffering. They were in despair. And if you know all of that, imagine how it must have sounded, their cries. I don't think it was, hey, Jesus, if you got a minute. I think it was going to be one of great desperation and tones of screams, and maybe he could do the impossible, like this woman in Florida hadn't seen for 2 decades, and one day she could see. It was a miracle. Even her doctor said it was a miracle. It's the only thing they could have hoped for, and so they cried. Verse 13 says, they lifted up their voices, Jesus, Master, have mercy upon us. And when he saw them, never even got to them, he said to them, now go and show yourself to the priests. And so it was that as they went, they were cleansed. I don't doubt that these men had heard of Jesus' power and healing. Back in chapter 10 of Matthew, there's the story of the Lord sending the 12 apostles out 2 by 2 to kind of go on their training run, right? He had given them power, and he had anointed them. He told them to not go to the Gentiles, not even go to the Samaritans. Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Preach the kingdom. Heal the sick. And then it says, and cleanse the leper. So I'm sure that the notoriety of Jesus' ability to heal the impossible was out there in the culture, that God had made himself known. When John the Baptist was in jail for speaking out about Herod's illicit marriage, and he'd been in jail for a while, he wondered if Jesus, if he was the Messiah, wasn't coming soon to make a move on the leadership, the rulership, to get him out of prison. Because John's opinion of Jesus was like everybody else's. He was going to be the earthly ruler, not the Savior. He's going to be the deliverer right now. And so he needed to learn. He was impatient. He finally got some of his servants to go travel up to where Jesus was. And the question they only had to ask him was, are you the one that we are waiting for, or should we be looking for somebody else? Because, man, you're letting me sit there a long time. You read there in Matthew chapter, I think, 11, that Jesus didn't answer their questions when they asked him that publicly. Instead, he turned around and he began to minister to folks and to do all that the Bible declared when the Messiah came, he would do. And so, after a while, Jesus turned around and he said to these servants of John, look, go tell John the things which you've heard and the things which you see. Tell him that the blind have received their sight. Tell him that the lame are walking, and tell him that the lepers are being cleaned and are being cleansed, and the deaf are hearing, and the dead are being raised back to life, and the poor are hearing the gospel preached to them. Go tell John what is the testimony of what God can do, the impossible. Convince John of what you've seen. But he mentions specifically, again, the cleansing of the lepers. Jesus apparently had cleaned or cleansed or healed many lepers as a testimony to who he was, as a living example of why he had come, that men had a deadly disease that couldn't be delivered from on their own. And I think of being one of these lepers and just the idea of entertaining the thought that what if I could be touched? What if the Lord would touch my life? I think I'd have been screaming pretty loud as well. Jesus was in their area. Their hopes soared. They had nothing to lose, everything to gain. This is too good to be true. Have you heard what he did? I wonder if he did. I wonder if that's a lie. I wonder if that's the truth. Tell people about the Lord. They wonder if you're telling them the truth. Oh, it's the truth. He can change your life. So, verse 14 tells us when Jesus finally saw them, when the voices came before the view of these men, they were heard and now seen, and the Lord immediately responds to their cry. He is willing, and so Jesus yells back, go show yourself to the priest. Didn't even go over to where they were, didn't lay his hands upon them, didn't wrap his arms around them, didn't spit in their eye or whatever he did, for healings. He just yelled over in their direction. The law stated that a cured leper, his first step to being declared healed or delivered was that he had to go show himself to the priest. They would re-examine him. They would check out, the places of the infection and did they see it outwardly or not. There is a great detail in the Bible in Leviticus 14 and 15. Can you imagine that there's an incurable disease that affects men for generations, and yet God in the law makes instructions, it says this way, for the leper in the day of his cleansing. In other words, you get sick, you die. You can't get rid of this. There's no treatment. And yet in the law of God as a rule, if the Lord speaks to you, touches you, heals you, then this is the procedure you have to follow. These are the offerings you have to make. This is the way you have to acknowledge that he indeed did this and no one else. And so there are very specific offerings and procedures that are laid out in great detail. And I suspect that by the time these guys got to the priest, that the priest went, I don't think I've ever done that one. I'm sure this was dusted in the back room somewhere and they had to go find it. Anybody know where that book is? I don't know. They were good at some things, but I doubt if they'd been memorized. This had never happened until Jesus came upon the scenes. This one, they were going to have to do by the book because no one had bothered. But isn't it interesting that in God's word, even the hopeless are left with hope? Till their last breath, God can do what man cannot. And he did for them. Jesus asked these men to take a step of faith. Just go show yourself to the priest. I wonder if they weren't thinking to themselves, no, we want to be healed. Maybe you don't understand. We heard about that John the Baptist guy. We'd like one of those. We'd like you to just come and Meet us where we are. Could we just have the discussion about what we've heard and what we think maybe you could do? And if you could just do that for us, we'll give you everything that we have. But you see, they're in a position where they're already infected. They've got nothing to lose. So what they believe God should do is really lost on them, because what they want is what God can do for them. And whatever he decides, however he's going to do it, that's going to be sufficient for them. And so he just says to them, go show yourself to the priest. A direct link to Leviticus 14 and 15, a direct link to the requirement for someone who's healed to go, and yet having nothing outwardly to say that's happened. Because we will read at the end of verse 14 that they weren't really healed until they went to go, or as they were going. And who knows how far they had to go. In the middle of the country, they may have to find a synagogue somewhere. There weren't certainly many in Samaria. They may have had to travel all the way to Jerusalem, or maybe up to the Galilee. But they were to go, and as they were going, they were healed. So there was no sign of improvement. There was no physical proof. I equated in my own mind to being saved. I remember when I gave my life to the Lord on a Thursday night in Bellflower in 1972, 73, 72, I think. Long time ago. But I remember going home and talking to my neighbor who had been a Christian for a long time, and he was always witnessing to me. And I would just go, hey, you want a beer? You know, I always bothered with the guy. But I had to go tell him, so I knocked on his door and I said, hey, I got saved tonight. He says, quit messing with me. He shut the door because I was always picking on. And I went home and I thought, how different do I feel? I'm supposed to feel different. I feel exactly the same. My feelings hadn't changed. It terrified me for a while. I thought, everybody's all crying and happy and standing up and jumping up and woo! And I think, I feel the same. And it wasn't until later I understood, look, it doesn't always mean that you have to feel different, but my relationship with God according to his word was every bit different. He had forgiven me. He has come to live in me. If I would rely on his promises, that's exactly what happened to me. I didn't feel any different. And I found that that's true a lot of times. Faith has to go first, right? Feelings are kind of like the caboose of an engine. It follows. You feel it later. But you got to do it now, because faith is just an action based upon a confidence in what God has said. I didn't feel saved, but I knew that I was. There was a conviction that came with it. But feelings seem to follow faith. Jesus said there, is it in John chapter 7, if you will do my will, then you'll know about the doctrine, whether it comes from the Lord or not, or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. In other words, if you'll do it, then you will learn it. But just hearing is not enough. You have to follow after. You have to act in faith. It's the same way that we got to know the Lord that I think we often have to walk with the Lord. There are times that our feelings are very supportive of our walks. They seem to contradict. At times, there's no support for the way I feel and the way that I believe. Other times, it seems to be just one and the same. Sometimes you ever go to church and go, I don't feel like singing. I don't want to worship. And yet, I've had a bad day. And yet, as you by faith begin to worship God and God inhabits the praises of his people, eventually you get strengthened and lifted up and you feel so good. I'm so glad I came to worship. It doesn't happen right away. Sometimes you don't want to go to church. Too tired. And yet, if I choose by faith to go, I come home blessed and at rest and thrilled about God's care. Or I'm too busy to pray. Oh, I don't want to pray. Too mad to forgive. Too hurt to respond. Too fearful to step out. Too self-conscious to think God can use me. And so it goes. Faith goes by conviction, and feelings oftentimes follow. They usually aren't the other way around. In fact, you're really out of sync if you're running by your feelings. So these two these 10 are yelled at by Jesus. Help me! And Jesus goes, go to the priest. All right. What have I got to lose? And off they head for the synagogue for an unscheduled appointment with a priest, having no indication that the Lord had touched them at all. They were going to have to walk by faith and be moved by his word, and that's really all that they had to go with. He doesn't heal them right away. They just have a direction from his word. So, blistered feet, bent body, maybe a long way to go. It's a long way, and the buses aren't running. Just to be obedient to the Lord. Back in chapter 5 of Luke, there is a story there of Jesus coming into a certain city, and there was a man who was filled with leprosy. That's the way it reads. And he said to the Lord, as he fell on his face, he began to beg the Lord, please, Lord, if you're willing, make me clean. And it says that Jesus put out his hand, touched him, and there, right on the spot, he said, I am willing, be clean. And then you read, immediately the leprosy left him. And they said, don't tell anyone. I don't know how that works either. Just go show yourself to the priest, making an offering to him for your cleansing, so you can be a testimony to the priests, even as Moses told us to do. But at least that man, when he was touched, was able to go to the priest with pretty good confidence. Look at me, I look like a little baby again. Clean, fair skin, beautiful. These guys had to go with all of their oozing sores and fears. But that's the way the Lord works. He doesn't heal everybody the same way. Why? Well, here's one thing you can add to your book of I knows. God designs every work in your life to meet your greatest need of being drawn closer to him. So wherever he does, however he does it, it's designed to bring you closer to him, right? And you can't put God in a box and say, well, you talk to that guy, you spit and be healed to that guy, and you hug this guy and touch that guy, and now you're giving these guys orders? No, you can't put God in a box. He'll do it the way he wants because it requires personal relationship, and God wants you to be personally touched, and that's different. So, he won't allow the touch-me-nots with the touch-me's to be in rivalry. Here's what the Lord did in my life. Yeah, well, this is what he did in my life. Well, I guess the Lord is the common denominator. So off they go in obedience. Well, keep your hand there and go to this 2 Kings chapter 5. We will probably get to this story in chapter 5 of 2 Kings in about 7 or 8 weeks on Wednesday nights, but we'll just get started with it for a little bit. We read in verse 1 of 2 Kings 5:1, now Naaman was the commander of the army of the kings of Syria, of the king of Syria, and he was a great and he was an honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given great victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor. He's a tough guy, honorable guy, but he was a leper. So here's a guy, Old Testament, not a Jew, but he had a lot of qualifications. He was great. He was courageous. The king loved him. He had brought the nation tremendous honor. He was a idolater, yet God had blessed him. He was a leader of the Syrian forces at the time. He literally had it all. I mean, as much as you would want in that culture, in that standing, he had, except he was a leper. He had power, he had success, he had position, he had honor, but he was a sinner, a leper, who I think would have given it all away to be healthy for just 5 minutes. He was under a death sentence. Now, not like Israel, he wasn't isolated. We don't read. The other countries didn't look at it that way, but he was certainly suffering. We read in verse 2 that the Syrians had gone out in raids and had brought back on one of the raids captive a young girl from the land of Israel who was taken to become a servant to Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, if only my master, Naaman, were with the prophet in Samaria, he could heal him of his leprosy, or he would heal him of his leprosy. I love the picture, and we don't have time to talk about her so much tonight, but I love the picture of how this young girl, captured in a war between nations, taken as a POW, but used in the life of a Syrian commander's house, is not a girl that you find grumbling about her condition, but she shows tremendous love for her captors. She doesn't grumble about her lot. She's blossoming where she's been planted. She's faithful to the Lord. And she says the nicest thing, there's a prophet in Samaria. Oh man, God's with that guy. And something could happen to your husband, to my boss. He could do the impossible, deliver him from something that's impossible. Verse 4, you, I guess, wouldn't wonder that word got back to Naaman fairly quickly, who then went in to his master, to the king. And he said, thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel. So he goes to the king of Syria. He's desperate for a solution. He wants to be cleansed. There's a little hope. Let's grab it. This is what she said. The captive little POW is now directing the show. And so the king of Syria, verse 5, said, well, then go. I'll send a letter with you to the king of Israel. And so he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, 10 changes of clothing. Let's just say he brought a mint with him. And then he also brought with him a letter to the king of Israel, which said, now be advised when this letter comes to you that I have sent Naaman, my servant, to you, that you might heal him of his leprosy. And it happened when the king of Israel read the letter that he tore his clothes, and he said, am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man would send him to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore, please consider and see how he's seeking out a quarrel with me. Notice in verse 5, this leper, unbeliever, outside the promises of even a covenant with Israel, he prepares himself for the best way that he knows how. He gets money, and he's going to try to bring payment with him. Sin has a lot of ways of trying to, win its way out through performance, through your own efforts. He takes the letter from his boss, from the king of Syria. He takes it to the king of Israel, who, by the way, is a total unbeliever, a wicked, totally wicked man. But remember, go back to verse 3. She said if he could just see the prophet in Samaria. She didn't say go see the king of Israel. But you see, we're going over the prophet's head, man. We deal on political terms. We know the guy in the big house, so to speak, right? And so this king of Israel, who is a wicked man, and there's no wonder that the Syrians are getting the better of him in battle. God is, I think, chastising them in the north. But anyway, he takes this letter to the king, and the king in Israel, though he is a wicked man, is ready immediately to offer the fact that only God could deal with this kind of issue. He could never address it. I can't fix this. How do I go about taking care of this? And so he reads the letter and says he wants to start a fight. This is just another way for him to come and raid and fight against us, and we haven't been doing very well, and now he's just a wicked way of starting another fight. Or we don't know how word got in verse 8 to Elisha, but we do read, and so it was when Elijah, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes. I guess he had an informant in the cabinet, that he sent a note to the king saying, why have you torn your clothes? Please let Naaman, literally, come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. Informed of the frustration of the king and suspicion of his heart, Elisha's response is far different because he knows God and he knows his ways. The man's coming to seek the Lord. Let's not let him leave disappointed. We're God's people. God is always ready to respond if someone's willing to seek him, especially to get deliverance from sin. You want to be saved. There's no waiting period. There's no quarantine. You can just cry out his name and he'll come. So, verse 9 tells us that Naaman then got on his horse and with his chariots, and he went over to the house of Elisha, and he stood at the door. I wrote in the margin years ago, here's the picture of an unbeliever coming to church. Right? He's stricken with an incurable disease. He arrives with all of his stuff because that's how we approach God until we're saved. We have pomp and circumstance, and God should be glad that I'm here now. I love him and he knows it. He relies on what he has and what he knows. I remember reading years ago the story of a famous artist in Paris who had hired a tramp who sat outside of his studio to come in and sit for him because he he loved the way this guy was kind of disheveled and sitting on the stoop, and he thought, I want to paint that. So he paid this guy to come in and just sit, and he says, could you do this for 3 days? The guy said, sure. And so he sat all day, and he paid him, and the next morning he came back, and the tramp had gone out and got a haircut and shaved and got a new pair of clothes, and he came on all spruced up, and the guy said, what in the world are you doing? Well, he had cleaned himself up, and now it was too late, The next time he showed up, the artist's plan was defeated. So, look, until you come to the Lord realizing you can't clean yourself up, He can't save you, right? You got to be sick to know you need a doctor. Jesus said that more than once. So here comes Naaman. It's kind of an interesting picture because he kind of arrives, and he's used to being respected by everyone. I'm sure he's got his soldiers with him and the bag of loot and however he's traveling, he's just showing up. Incurable disease, unbeliever at church. Verse 10 tells us, Elijah then, as a response, sends a messenger to him. And the messenger says, why don't you just go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and then your flesh will be restored to you. You'll be clean. Elisha doesn't come personally, I suspect, because Naaman was used to honor, and Elisha was not. He wanted the Lord to be honored. He didn't want to enter into that respecting and deference thing. He wanted him to come to the Lord. And look, to come to the Lord, you got to be humble, right? You can't come on your high horse. Besides, Elijah knew that the message was far more important than the messenger. And so he wanted to be sure that the king was looking to God and not to a messenger. And he didn't want to get in his way. So the directions are very simple, aren't they? Go and wash in the Jordan, dip 7 times, you'll be good. It's all that's required. You're going to look just great. You need to be washed. We have to be washed in the blood of the Lamb to be made whole. Well, imagine how that sits with Naaman. He's waiting for something. How much is it going to cost me? What do I have to do? How am I going to get this worked out? And instead we read, verse 11, that this powerful man from the north became furious. And he turned around to leave. And he said, indeed, I said to myself, he will certainly come out to me. He'll stand over there. He'll call on the name of the Lord his God. He'll wave his hands over the place, and then I'll be healed of my leprosy. Are there not the Abana and Pharpar, the rivers in Damascus and Syria that are far better than all the waters of Israel? Should I not have washed in them and be clean? And so he turned away, and he ran out, and he went away with rage. Notice in verse 11, Naaman's understanding of his encounter with God's prophet, and he came with this attitude. Here's what I think you should do. Here's what I believe you should do. Certainly he's going to come out to me. He's going to do like this. He's going to rub my head and do like this and call an enchantment. Yeah, it's going to be cool. I'm just going to go bow my head and go along with it, and then I'm going to go home all better. This is what I expect, right? Everyone has their idea of how they expect God to work. Here's how God should save me. Here's how God should answer my prayer. Here's how God should work in this situation. And yet you read in the Bible, let the wicked man forsake his ways, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return to the Lord. He'll have mercy to God. He'll abundantly pardon him. So picture yourself standing there with Naaman, who's just fuming, but he's also covered in sores and painful, embarrassed, with a disease he can't put his finger on. The king won't help him. Now he's second stop in Israel, and this guy tells him to go dip in a dirty Jordan River, and he's got cleaner water at home. And I thought to myself, certainly this is how it's supposed to go. Well, maybe it is, but maybe they're not thinking the same way God is. So his pride is bruised. He's inflamed. He's angry. You would think in his desperation he might be a little bit more tolerant. All right, I'll try it. It seems dumb, but hey, I've come this far. And I'll get to take my silver back home and my gold. But he doesn't. You see, the pride of life will keep you from God's life so much. What right did he have to argue? He had a great need and no solution. This isn't the time to argue. This is time to just go along with the program. That little girl in our house there in Syria talked about this prophet. Well, he turned to leave. We read in verse 13 that the servants that had come with him, standing by him, said, Father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, wouldn't you have done it? How much more then when he just says to you, go and wash, be clean? It seemed to take some Herculean kind of effort on the part of his friends to change his mind about leaving. But it was an argument you couldn't argue with. I mean, it was a perfect argument. How could you try? Look, he said, look, don't give up here. If he'd asked you to do something hard, you'd have done it. You're mad because he didn't ask you to do anything. You can't get credit. You just have to obey. And I love the picture of the Lord's patience here with us and with him. Right? He refused. He was angry. He argued. Well, look, if you could have earned it, you'd have done it. But you can't earn it. They're not letting you do that. He just wants you to go wash. What have you got to lose? Man, let's go do that. Go wash. So Naaman, Lambo, went willingly, and God met him faithfully. Verse 14, so he went down, dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the sayings of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child. He was clean, and he returned to the man of God, he and all of his aides, and he came and he stood before him and said, indeed, now I know there's a God in the earth, nowhere except in Israel. Therefore, please take this gift from your servant. Heart changed, body healed, testimony immediately drastically changed. The entire entourage saw it. He turns from his false God to the living God. God worked in a mysterious way, all right. He dipped 7 times. I can see him doing like 5 and then looking at his skin saying, this is ridiculous. Just do 2 more, man. Come on. I don't want to do 2. I'm mad. I'll let you finish the story on your own. But let's go back to Luke. We'll save something for the other Wednesday when we get there. Back to chapter 17 of Luke, verse 14. And Jesus said, go show yourself to the priest. And so it was that as they went, they were cleansed. Now, I don't know about you, but, I love the Gospels because it allows you to just kind of immerse yourself in the story. Imagine walking with these guys who slowly begin to see things happen. Maybe the nose reemerges. Because with leprosy, a lot of times it falls off. The skin clears, new fingers grow back, eyelashes reappeared, or toes or hair. Well, no, not hair. New birth physically, right? Each of them a testimony. Only God can do this. Nobody can do this. This doesn't happen. In the group of 10, however, there was only one who was thankful. Thankful enough to stop on the way to wherever they were going and say to himself, oh my goodness, look what has just happened to me. I've got to go back and thank him. The one who yelled at me from afar. I've got to go back and acknowledge who he is. I know he told me to go to the priests. I know that I have to get a certification to get back in society, but look, that can wait. I have to go thank him first. And the ceremony and the restoration to society that he had waited years for and only could dream about, he now puts on the back burner because he has this spiritual obligation to go back and thank the Lord, who is just overwhelmed by it. He can't believe he's clean. His life has been changed. And the one who goes back isn't even a Jew. He's a Samaritan. We read in verse 15, and one of them, when he saw that he was healed, returned. With a loud voice, he glorified God, and he fell down on his face at Jesus' feet and gave him thanks. And he was a Samaritan. Though Jew and Gentiles were enemies in suffering, they were brought together. Though the Samaritans and the Jews hated each other, when man is lost, he throws you in with everyone else who's lost. This fella is speechless. He doesn't know what to do, but I've got to go back and thank him. I've got to acknowledge his work in my life. I've got to love him and worship him. An overwhelming, life-changing miracle had taken place. How could he not go back? Well, there were 9 other guys who didn't. They kept walking. They got to the priest. They got a stamp of approval. And they went back to their lives, better than they had been before they had been touched, but still not changed, still not thankful. The Samaritan personally touched, parted company with the religious men to go back and worship Jesus on his face. And notice again, he came back to worship God, to acknowledge who Jesus was. He gave thanks. He worshiped and glorified God. Jesus again is called God here. Loud voice. And by the way, the words a loud voice, 2 words in Greek, it's where we get our word megaphone from. He was loud. I'm sure he was used to yelling unclean, but now he was yelling praises. He thanks the Lord loudly, and why not? Isn't that the way worship should be? It's kind of weird worshiping with masks, isn't it? I don't know what you're doing. Then I thought, for some people, that's not so bad. The Lord still hears them, and that's probably good enough. No, man, our neighbors should hear us worshiping. We're going to heaven. We've been cured of leprosy. Nobody else can cure us. Our religion didn't do it. Our society can't do it. Our political persuasion won't touch us either. It's kind of like those on the wall with Nehemiah singing so far that they could be heard throughout the land. Maybe our neighbors should hear us clapping and singing, because we're kind of like this guy, aren't we? Healed. Well, we are told in verse 17 that Jesus responded to this man's worship and said, were there not 10 that were cleansed? Where are the other 9? Or where are the 9? Were there not any found who returned to give glory to God except for this foreigner? Jesus missed the praise he deserved. His tone was one of sadness. Remember, this is Jesus, also the man. Surprised. Had not God done great things in the lives of 10? Where was their grateful worship? Now look, it's easy to read this and be very critical of the other 9. What a bunch of, thankless bunch of people. I can't believe it. But be careful, because sometimes we do the very same thing. What can I render to the Lord for all of his benefits towards me? How often do you run off with blessings, never to thank the Lord, never to worship loudly with thanksgiving? We just we take and then we need some more. The psalmist wrote in Psalm 107, oh, that men would give thanks to the Lord for his goodness, his wonderful works to the children of men. Let us sacrifice him the sacrifices of thanksgiving. And then go out and declare his works with rejoicing. There's something about being satisfied, isn't there? And thankful. I know through this whole little trial these last 2 or 3 months, I've heard more complaints than I have or anything else. People complain, the state's not fair, the rules aren't fair, my life is all upside. Look, God knows what he's doing. He's worth worshiping, isn't he? So let him be the boss. Find out what the Lord wants to teach you. It might be different than what someone said next to you, but God has something to talk to you about. So this one guy comes back with a loud voice. But notice Jesus. Where are the other 9? Incredulous. Weren't they healed like you? Paul often stopped to thank the Lord for his blessings. You can read the book of Acts and you'll just read him thanking God. Just look that up. Thanks God constantly. Lord, thank you. Thank you for touching them and raising them up. We read in in Colossians chapter 3, Paul writing to the Colossians, may the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which you were called to one body, and be thankful. Come on, Colossians, be thankful. He wrote to the Hebrews in chapter 13, let us offer continually the sacrifice of praise to God, the fruit of our lips being thankful in his name. We should be thankful, shouldn't we? I know that we aren't always. Israel had been blessed more than any other nation. They had plenty of reasons to be thankful. And yet who came back? A Samaritan. A guy who he got it. He wasn't lost in the religion of it all. He just came to worship. He was desperate. He did what he was told. He was turned and touched, and in obedience, he came back thankful. And then we read in verse 19 something very interesting. Arise and go your way. Your faith has made you well. I think the word well there, and the King James has it very right, is the word whole. Because a more fatal disease than leprosy now melted away from the man's heart. He came back thankful. He was given life, right? He knew who the Lord, he came into a relationship with the Lord. He came to Jesus with his need. He obeyed what he was told. He was delivered by him and returned to worship him. The other 9 were kind of worse off. They were healthy in body, but still very dead in spirit. They hadn't acknowledged the Lord. It left them unchanged. And if they didn't change, down the road one day there was going to be a horrible future. Because there's a difference between being cleansed and being made whole, right? Being touched. Because faith and thanksgiving, they have to go together. Faith isn't passive. It acts as this man did. There's a believing that doesn't save you. You can read about it in James, right? That the demons believe and they tremble, but their lives weren't changed. So, what a great story. One guy, the 10th leper, he shows up for all of 10 verses and says to us, are you thankful? Are you made whole? As the Lord does a miracle, then with a megaphone for a worship voice, go tell the world. Faith and thanksgiving, they have to run together. Don't they? Are you thankful? We should be for sure. Shall we pray together? Father, thank you tonight for your word to us and how wonderful it is that we sit here tonight in the midst of all of these doubts and the fears of man and the constant upheaval. And we do pray for our country tonight that there would be healing and deliverance. Lord, I think about that verse I was reading today in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, where, Lord, you said through Solomon, do you see injustice among people and the oppression of the poor? Don't marvel. That's the way of the world. And yet then he calls us to live differently. So may we not be overwhelmed with what we see, but may we seek to do better, to do different. And tonight, Lord, as we sit together, may we be thankful. We're so thankful that we can be in church again tonight. We're so thankful that you've kept us from being sick, and you've kept our body as well. We thank you that you are a God who is able to do more than we could ask or think. We thank you for the many folks who have gotten saved these last 13 weeks online that may never have listened, but they couldn't go out. They were forced to listen. We pray for our brethren that are in the process of learning to come back to church, and maybe with fear, that you give them peace tonight. And you give them rest. You convince them, Lord, that you're a good God. And we can rely upon you. We can be wise and yet faithful. And Lord, more than anything else, we're so thankful tonight that our names are written in the book of life. And that the work that you did will assure us that one day we will stand before God and be welcomed into your presence with great joy because of what you've done for us. And tonight, if you're listening online or if you're here and you haven't given Jesus your life, look, there is sin, and it is insidious, just like leprosy. It'll affect and infect every part of your life. It'll cloud your view and your desires. It'll even lie to you to tell you you're okay when you're not. It'll deceive and it'll misdirect, and it'll steal from you the very life God has. And there's no way to get rid of sin. We can apologize for it, we can acknowledge it, but until we're saved from it, there's no way. Sin will have dominion over your life and mine. But Jesus promises that if we would call upon his name, he would save us, not only from the future judgment of sin, but for the very present power of sin, and give to us the ability to say no to sin, to say yes to God, to overcome, to be overcomers, to be more than that. And he can do that for you tonight. And if you're here with us, you can come and pray with one of the pastors up front after the service. If you're online tonight, look down in the box and find that link that takes you to the place of those new believer studies where you can begin to go through the Bible with us and find out what God has promised to you. Or you can call the office in the morning. We'll be happy to answer your questions and pray with you. But look, the Lord is waiting to see those who will come back. I know that during this crisis time, this difficult time, this time of upheaval, there's a lot of people praying, maybe to a God they don't know very well. But as the Lord tonight is speaking to you, he wants you to know he knows you plenty well. And if you'll turn to him, if you'll look to him, if you'll listen to him, he'll give you life. He promises to. It's his great joy to bless you and to save you. But don't let this night pass you by. If God has your attention, come and let him give you life.